My daughter put a for sale sign on my front lawn on a Thursday afternoon in March, and she did not call first. I found it when I came home from my watercolor class at the Brant Arts Center. The sign was already staked into the frozen ground, facing the street, the agency's red lettering, catching the flat late winter light. I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes and looked at it. Then I went inside and put the kettle on. My name is Gloria. I am 67 years old. I have lived in this house on Elmgrove Drive in Burlington, Ontario since October of 1981, which is 44 years, which is longer than my daughter has been alive. Welcome to Fierce Mom Stories, where women who were quietly counted out get to say what actually happened. Hit subscribe and drop a comment. I read everyone. Frank and I bought this house for $89,500. We were 23 and 26. Our realtor, a cheerful man in a plaid coat, told us we were stretching. He was right. We ate a lot of soup that first winter, and not the good kind. Frank was working for a sheet metal company on Plains Road, and I had just taken a job as a file clerk at a law firm in Hamilton, carrying documents from one office to another and learning slowly to understand what they said. 44 years! That's how long I've woken up in the back bedroom of this house and heard the birch tree Frank planted along the fence line catch the wind. He planted a lilac, too, along the south side of the back fence in the spring of 1982. He put it too close to the fence, and it grows sideways now, reaching past the cedar boards toward the yard next door. Every May it blooms anyway, enormous and purple, and so fragrant you can smell it from the front walk. It has outlived him by 4 years. Frank died in November of 2021. He was 64 years old, cardiac. He had been perfectly fine the Friday before, and then he wasn't, and the paramedics told me later there was nothing that would have changed the outcome. I have had 4 years to learn how to say that sentence without stopping partway through it. People ask what I did for a living, and I tell them I worked at a law firm. That's true. What I don't usually say is which kind of law, or how long, or what I actually spent 3 decades doing. Because the moment you say real estate law, people's eyes move past you to something more interesting. For 31 years, I worked as a senior legal secretary at Morrison & Hartley on King Street West in Hamilton. Real property transactions, everyone. Purchases, refinances, discharges, title searches. Transmasters that went sideways. Couples buying their first house with shaking hands, and couples selling their last one in circumstances I didn't ask about. I prepared the documents. I sent them to the land registry office. I received the registrations back and filed them correctly. I learned, over 31 years, to read a deed the way some people read a face. I knew which clauses mattered and which were boilerplate. I knew what a life interest looked like in a granting clause before the paralegal across the table had found the right page. Remember that. It comes back later. On a Saturday in February, my daughter came over with a bakery box and a glossy brochure. She is 44 years old. She has Frank's patience and her own husband's habit of treating any room he walks into as a meeting he called. She set the brochure on the kitchen table and slid it toward me without saying anything first. Hearthstone Retirement Living. A silver-haired woman on the cover smiling at a cup of tea. Monthly rates starting at $4,200. Studios from 480 square feet. My son-in-law was with her. He's 51, general contracting, a man who solves problems by making them someone else's. He stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the backyard with the expression he gets when he has already decided something. My daughter said, "We've been thinking about the house, Mum." I put the kettle on. She said the upstairs bathroom hadn't been updated since the 90s. She said the stairs were steep. There are 11 stairs and they are not steep. She said the yard was too much for one person. She said, and this is the sentence I have turned over 100 times since, "Dad would have wanted you to be comfortable." She said it to the table, not to me. I asked her a question I already knew the answer to. "Who did you talk to before you talked to me?" She looked at the brochure. "There's a man," my son-in-law said from the window. "Wade, he does senior relocations. He's been really helpful." Senior relocations, 2 words that sound like a service and mean an eviction. I asked what Wade had been helpful with. My son-in-law said Wade had done a market assessment. He said with Burlington prices the way they were, we'd be leaving equity on the table if we waited. We, again. That word, plural, about something with my name on the deed. My daughter tapped the brochure. You'll be comfortable there, Mum. There are people your own age. 7 words, delivered to a photograph of a woman having tea. I poured the water. I let it steep. I said, do you want to see the backyard before you go? And she said no, they had plans, and they left the brochure on my table. I read it after their car pulled out. Hearthstone had a rooftop patio and a weekly bridge club and a shuttle to the Masonville Mall. The 480-square-foot studio was on the 2nd floor and faced a parking structure. I put the brochure in the drawer with the takeout menus. Then I went out back and stood beside Frank's lilac for a while, because I needed to be somewhere he had been. Here is what I want to say on behalf of my daughter, and I'm going to say it because the truth is more complicated than the version where she is simply the villain. When Frank got sick and he had 2 difficult years before November, a slow decline high doctors kept calling. Managed. My daughter drove Highway 401 from London every other weekend. She organized his prescriptions. She sat with him through the nights I couldn't. She researched home care options and palliative programs and made phone calls I didn't have the capacity to make. That was real. I have never pretended otherwise. But something grew in that time. A belief that sacrifice creates entitlement. That what you give in one season authorizes what you take in the next. In the summer of 2019, when Frank was still mobile but frightening us, we went to see an estate planning lawyer on Locust Street. Frank wanted to sort the house. He didn't want me sitting in Ontario's courts for 2 years over a 3-bedroom split level. We all sat around the table, and the lawyer explained the transfer. My son-in-law was there. He was on his phone for half of it. The lawyer said, and I am going to be precise, so we're transferring the property to your daughter, with a life estate reserved for you, Gloria, for the duration of your natural life. That is exactly what was said. My son-in-law looked up from his phone and nodded. He did not ask what a life estate was. He should have asked. In 2022, there was a situation. My daughter called on a Tuesday to say she'd spoken to someone at my bank about consolidating my GICs and moving them into something with better returns. She had spoken to someone at my bank. With my account numbers. Using the continuing power of attorney I had signed in 2020 when my knee surgery was scheduled, and I'd wanted someone who could act for me if I couldn't. I asked her to describe exactly what she had done. She said it was just an inquiry. It was not just an inquiry. The investment advisor called me the next morning to confirm a redemption request. I did not raise my voice. I told my daughter I was revoking her authority under the CPOA, effective immediately. She said I was overreacting. I said that might be true and that I was still revoking it. The following Monday, I drove to the Land Registry office on Main Street West in Hamilton. I filed a revocation of power of attorney. It was registered against the property that afternoon, document number on record. I sent a copy to my daughter by registered mail with signature confirmation. The card came back to my mailbox 9 days later. The signature is not hers. It's a wide looping cursive with an R that curls back on itself. My son-in-law signed for it. In late February, a man named Wade Garfield appeared at my front door. 48, quarter zip with his brokerage logo on the chest, the kind of man who remembers your dog's breed on a second visit, even if you don't have a dog. He called me Mrs. Sinclair, which nobody has called me since Frank's funeral, and he asked to view the property, which is what agents say instead of walk through your house while you stand aside. I let him in. I want you to note that I let him in. He measured nothing. He photographed everything on his phone. He told me the upstairs bathroom had room for buyer personalization, which is what agents say when they mean outdated. He said the furnace might need disclosure. The furnace was replaced in 2019. I have the invoice. At the door on his way out, I asked him a direct question. I asked whether he understood that I lived here. He gave me a look I have seen on men who have already made a decision and are now being kind about it. Of course, he said. But in these transitions, the family usually guides the process. I've been through this a few times. It goes smoothly. He told me about his mother, macular degeneration, a house in Ancaster he sold in 38 days. He said it was the right call. He said it twice. I believe that he believed it. That's what turned my stomach. He wasn't running a con. He'd built a business on the sincere conviction that families decide and owners cope. He had never once asked me a question and then waited for the answer. In the third week of March, my daughter signed the listing agreement. Not as my daughter in the emotional sense. As my attorney, in fact. There is a line on those forms, and she wrote her name on it and 4 words beside it. 2 days later, Wade emailed me a courtesy copy. He copied me the way you'd copy a building manager. I printed it at the library on New Street for 20 cents a page. I read it at my kitchen table with a pen Frank left in the cup by the phone. A red Bic, nothing remarkable. He went through a dozen of them a year, and somehow one ended up staying. I underlined one line, a reference to a continuing power of attorney, dated September 2020. No mention of the registered revocation from 2022. The lockbox went on the following Thursday. Wade clipped it to the door handle himself, tested it twice, and said it would make showings easier for me. Everything they did that spring, they did to make things easier for me. That evening, I went to the garage. Frank's old tackle box is on the second shelf of the pegboard, between a jar of hex bolts and a folded drop cloth. It was his, organized in the particular way of his. Spinners in one tray, hooks sorted by size. In the next, the leaders wound onto small cardboard squares with the test weight written in his handwriting. He last fished from it 4 summers before he died. He hasn't touched it in 4 years, and it is still organized exactly as he left it. I thought about getting the bolt cutters. I had a very clear picture of that lockbox shackle giving way in 2 seconds. Then I thought, if I cut it tonight, she puts a new one on tomorrow, and I'd know that the door I was still hoping might open had closed. I wasn't ready to know that. I went inside. I left the light on over the stove the way I always do. The stager came the 2nd week of April. She moved my furniture with a brisk competence that suggested she did not much concern herself with whose furniture it was. She called my mother's china cabinet a statement piece, which in staging terms means she wanted it in the garage. I said no. She said understood, in the voice people use when they've heard a no and filed it as temporary. My son-in-law came on the 2nd showing day to help with the garage. He is not a cruel man. He is a man who solves problems by taking them apart, and in his mind the problem was a house full of things that had stopped being useful. He reached for Frank's tackle box. I was in the doorway. "That stays," I said. He put his hands up in a good-natured way and said, "Of course, no problem." Then he went back inside, and I stood in the garage for a while with the tackle box where Frank had left it. The sign went in on a Friday. By Saturday morning, my neighbors had a version of me. My neighbor 3 doors down, Barbara, 68, we have been trading zucchini since the 90s, came over Sunday evening with a chicken casserole wrapped in foil. She hugged me at the door and held my arms and looked at my face the way you look at something fragile. "You just say the word," she said, "if it's too much, if you're not." She didn't finish. The end of that sentence was already in the room. Then she said, "Your daughter says it's all been sorted, that you've got a lovely spot lined up." Sorted, like laundry. The street had a version of me by then. A version where I couldn't manage the stairs, where Frank's death had left me uncertain, where my daughter was being admirable. Every neighbor I ran into that spring said some version of the same thing. That I'd be comfortable, that I'd make friends, that Hearthstone had good programming. Nobody asked me one question with a blank space after it. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because that's the part that actually landed hardest. Not the sign, not the lockbox, the pronoun. I had become on my own street in the house I bought when Trudeau was still the first one, a situation that was being handled. The open house was a Saturday in late April, 11 to 2. Wade texted the night before that it would be easiest if I wasn't on site. Smiley face. I got dressed, put on my earrings, and walked over to Barbara's porch. She brought out 2 mugs of tea, and we watched 15 groups of people walk through my house. A couple stood in the driveway and debated the garage orientation. A man in a vest took photos of the backyard from the gate without coming in. 2 women in their 30s walked out of the house, discussing the kitchen as if they were critiquing a menu. One of them said, "It's very original." The other said, "Everything is original." They both laughed. The lockbox knocked against the door every time someone opened it. From Barbara's porch, it sounded like someone checking whether anyone was home. Around noon, a family came out with a small boy, maybe 5. He grabbed a branch of Frank's lilac where it hangs over the front fence and pulled. A whole spray came off in his hand. A long limb with 4 buds that were never going to open now. His father told him to put it down. He dropped it on the sidewalk. Nobody picked it up. Barbara said very quietly, "Oh, Gloria." I said, "It's a tough plant. It'll come back." I did not cry on that porch. Not because I am strong. Because I understood that everything I did was going to be read as evidence of something, and I intended to control what evidence there was. At the end of April, they accepted an offer. A couple in their early 30s, first home, a Portuguese water dog named Biscuit. Wade emailed me the acceptance sheet like it was a gift. My daughter called that night, warm in a way she hadn't been in months, and said they got over asking, and wasn't that wonderful? And Hearthstone had a unit available with a south-facing window. She said, "You don't have to worry about a thing." That night I took a piece of paper and wrote 3 things down: the closing date, the buyer's lawyer's name, the land registry document number from the 2019 transfer deed. 31 years of muscle memory. You write down the document number. I had been putting off the next step since February. I drove to the land registry office on Main Street West in Hamilton on a Wednesday morning. Anyone can walk in. Anyone can search the parcel register. You take a number, you sit in a chair, and when it's called, you go to the counter and ask for the record on a given address. It costs you nothing to look. I want that on record. Nothing I did that morning required a license, a lawyer, or a favor. It required a parking spot on Main. The search came back with the usual layers. The original purchase in 1981, the discharge of the mortgage, the refinance in 2004 and again in 2012. And 2 entries I was already expecting to find, because I'm the one who put them there. The first, a transfer registered in August of 2019. I asked for a certified copy. The clerk printed it, embossed it, and I paid $9. Standing at the counter, I read the granting clause aloud under my breath, the way I used to read documents at my desk at Morrison and Hartley. Gloria Ann Sinclair and Franklin Douglas Sinclair, husband and wife, hereby transfer and convey to Sharon Elizabeth Moreau the real property described herein, reserving unto the transferors and the survivor of them a life estate in said property for the term of their natural lives. Reserving unto the transferors and the survivor of them. Me! The second document, the revocation of power of attorney, registered in 2022. Document number on file. It says that the continuing power of attorney I signed in September 2020, naming my daughter as my attorney in fact for property, is revoked in its entirety. Any person dealing with this property is on notice. That revocation had been sitting in the public parcel register for 3 years. Any person who typed my address into the Terraview terminal at the county office could have found it on any afternoon for 3 years. My daughter, my son-in-law, a licensed real estate agent who had photographed my kitchen and staked a sign in my yard. $9 and a parking spot on Main Street. That was the entire barrier to knowing. I folded the certified copies in thirds and put them in my purse with the receipt. I drove home along the lake because I needed the extra 20 minutes. My granddaughter, my daughter's daughter, 22, finishing her social work degree at McMaster. Called me on a Sunday in early May. She had seen her mother post the listing on Facebook, 3 exclamation marks, and the words "big changes for our family." She was furious in the specific way of young people who have not yet learned to be careful about their fury. She came over in her work clothes and sat on the back step and cried, which I was not prepared for. She said she'd called her mother and been told to stay out of it. She said, "Grandma, why are you letting them do this?" I told her what my old colleague Meredith had told me the week before. Meredith, who had spent 40 years doing estate law in Hamilton, and whom I had called on a Tuesday evening when I needed to hear it from someone else, she had said it plainly. If you fight this in your kitchen, it becomes a story about your mental state. You need to fight it in a room where the only thing that matters is what's been registered. I told my granddaughter, "Let them get all the way to the room where someone has to read the deed out loud." She said, "And then what?" I said, "Then you'll see." She said, "Okay." And every week after that, she brought takeout on Thursday evenings, and she never once talked about me in the third person while I was standing in the room. If this is hitting close to home, if you know what it is to be the last one told about your own life, drop a comment before we go any further and stay to the end. What happens at that closing is the whole reason I'm telling you this. Now I want to say why I didn't simply refuse in February and be done with it. Part of it was practical. A woman I'd worked alongside for 9 years at the firm, Meredith had sent me the file. I won't give her name, had fought back loudly in her kitchen in 2023 when her son decided she shouldn't be managing her own accounts. She was eloquent, and she was right, and 4 months later, she was served with an application for a guardianship order in Ontario Superior Court. The supporting affidavit contained 2 paragraphs about that kitchen conversation. It cost her $34,000 to fight it, and something quiet in her that never quite came back. She won. She kept her accounts. She also stopped having people over. When my daughter put the brochure on my table, I called Meredith that same week. She told me something I have repeated to myself 200 times since. She said, "If you fight in your kitchen, you lose. Not because you're wrong, because the kitchen is their room. Pick the room where what you say doesn't matter, where the only thing that matters is what's written down." I said, "I know exactly the room." She said, "I thought you might." But here is the other reason, the one I'd rather not say into a camera. I was waiting for my daughter to stop on her own. Every morning in March and April and into May, I woke up and I thought, today is the day she calls. Today she pulls into the driveway and comes up those 2 stairs and says, "Mom, I got ahead of myself." That's all it would have taken. Not a long conversation. 1 sentence at my door and I would have handed her a cup of tea, and we would never have spoken of it again. I had not finished hoping for it yet. I haven't stopped thinking about the version of things where that call came. The closing was set for the 2nd Tuesday in June at the buyer's lawyer's office on Brant Street in Burlington. My daughter called a week before to say I needed to come sign some paperwork. Occupancy confirmation. A release form. 10 minutes. Just bring your license. 10 minutes. She had reduced the last legal act I would perform in this house to a utility form and 10 minutes. The night before, I took my navy cardigan out of the closet and laid it on the chair. I set out my purse with my driver's license in the outside pocket. I called Meredith at home. She permits that exactly twice per client. And told her the closing was the next morning. She said, "You know what happens." I said, "They'll run the title search the morning of closing." She said, "The life estate exception is still open." It was. No one had called me to discuss it. No one had asked me to sign a release. The life estate had been sitting in the parcel register since August of 2019, and the revocation had been sitting there since 2022, and not one person in that transaction had opened the file properly. I have watched this happen for 3 decades from my desk at Morrison and Hartley. Buyers skim, agents forward. Lawyers get there eventually, but sometimes not until the morning of. And on the morning of, somebody always has to read it out loud. Meredith said. "Do you want me there?" I said no. I said it for a reason. If Meredith walks in, it becomes her play. If I walk in alone with my license and my purse, it is just a woman at the end of a table, while the record does what records do. She said, "Don't explain anything. Don't help them. They'll find it." I said I had absolutely no intention of helping. I ironed my cardigan that night, which I had not done since Frank's funeral. I set out my good shoes. I put the 2 certified copies in my purse, still folded in thirds with the embossed seal. I put Frank's red pen back in the cup on the counter. There was nothing left to check. If you have ever ironed a blouse for a room where someone expected you to be furniture, you already know exactly what I was doing at that ironing board. I arrived at the lawyer's office on Brant Street 8 minutes early. The conference room had a laminate table that seated 8 and a box of tissues in the middle, because lawyers who close real estate deals know that sometimes people cry. The buyers arrived first. They were lovely, and I want you to know that they were lovely, because that was genuinely the hardest part of the morning. She had a folder with a photo of their dog clipped to the front. Their lawyer, a woman in a gray blazer with reading glasses on a chain, shook my hand. Wade arrived with 2 pens. My son-in-law arrived on the phone saying, yeah, we're signing right now. My daughter came in last and sat at the opposite end of the table from me and did not look up. The lawyer went through the stack of documents. Then she paused. She looked at her screen. Then she looked at the title binder clipped to the left side of her file. Then she looked at me. 1 beat too long. "Before we proceed," she said, "I need to flag something from the parcel register." The room went still the way rooms do when something is about to change. She turned her screen so the table could see it. She read the way someone reads something they want to get exactly right. In 2019, the property was transferred to the registered owner, with a life estate expressly reserved for Gloria Ann Sinclair for the term of her natural life. Mrs. Sinclair is the life tenant. She holds possessory interest. A transfer of fee simple cannot be completed without her written consent and her joinder as a party. My son-in-law said, "What does that mean?" Wade said, "I'm sorry, what?" The lawyer said, "It means Mrs. Sinclair has to sign the transfer, not as a witness, as a party to the transaction." My daughter said, "She's here, she can sign now." "There's a second matter," the lawyer said. She was calm in the specific way of people who do difficult work correctly. The continuing power of attorney under which the listing agreement was executed. I'm looking at the registration history. There is a revocation of power of attorney registered on title in 2022. Document number on record. The listing agreement and the accepted offer were signed under an authority that had been revoked and registered for 3 years. Wade said, "That's not possible." The lawyer said, "It's registered." My daughter stood up. She said, "Mom, what did you do?" I had been waiting for that sentence. I had heard it in my head every morning for 4 months. I opened my purse. I took out the Hearthstone Retirement Living brochure. I had carried it in my purse since February, since the morning she slid it across my kitchen table, and I set it in the middle, face up, where the buyers could read the cover across the table from me. Then I took out the certified copy of the registered revocation and set it beside it. Then I took out a small white card. Registered mail signature confirmation, postmark 2022. A wide looping cursive with an R that curls back on itself. My son-in-law's handwriting on the delivery confirmation for a document he had apparently never mentioned to his wife. He made a sound. My daughter turned and looked at him. She said, "You signed for something." He said, "I get so much mail." I stayed in my chair. I said 7 words clearly without raising my voice. "I live here. I'm not signing." After that, it was all procedure, and I want you to understand that, because procedure is the whole point. The lawyer told the room she could not complete the transaction. She could not issue clear title without the life tenant's consent. The buyer's mortgage required clear title. Without it, the lender would not fund. Without funding, there was no closing. Everyone turned and looked at me. All 7 faces at once. I stood up once that whole morning. I picked up my license and put it in my purse. I looked at my daughter, who was still standing. "You get this house," I said. "You've always been getting it. You get it the day I am finished with it, and not one morning sooner." I said good morning to the buyers. I told them I was sorry, and I meant it genuinely. I walked out of the conference room, down the elevator, and into the parking lot on Brant Street. I sat in my car for 6 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. The transaction dissolved that afternoon. The following Monday, I mailed the buyers a certified check for their appraisal fee, their inspection fee, and their rate hold extension. I included a note that said none of what happened was their fault. The young woman wrote back a week later with a photo of their dog. I filed a complaint with the Real Estate Council of Ontario about Wade Garfield, not for the deed, which he had no duty to understand, but for proceeding with a listing under a power of attorney without verifying whether that authority was still in force against a registered title. He never checked. His brokerage removed their senior relocation service page within the month. I made a report to Elder Abuse Services through the Hamilton office. A caseworker came out the following week and sat at my kitchen table for 50 minutes and read the entire file I handed her: the listing agreement, the registered revocation, the signed delivery confirmation. She said, "Most of what comes to us is a phone call with a feeling. This is documented. A file was opened. It is not empty." The following Thursday, I went to the garage. Frank's bolt cutters were hanging on the pegboard where he left them. I took them down, walked to the front door, and cut the lockbox off in 2 seconds. 53 days of that thing knocking against my wood. 2 seconds. Barbara came across the street that afternoon and stood on my front walk and apologized. She held my hands. She said, "Not one of us asked you anything. Not one of us," I said. "No, but you're asking now." I went to the Land Registry office on Main Street and filed a new declaration. I changed the locks. I made a new continuing power of attorney fee for property and named my granddaughter as my attorney in fact. I did not touch a single word of the 2019 transfer deed. Not one line of it. Frank signed that deed with a hand that shook. He knew what it said. He wanted his daughter to have this house when I was done with it. I am not going to undo my husband's last legal wish because his son-in-law had a bad year and his daughter stopped reading past the first page. My granddaughter comes for dinner on Thursday evenings. She leaves early because she has placements on Friday mornings. I hear her car in the driveway at 6:15, and sometimes I am already awake, and I make the coffee and stand at the kitchen window while the light comes up over Frank's lilac. In May, the lilac bloomed the way it always does. Enormous and purple and a little sideways, reaching past the fence toward the neighbor's yard like it's still looking for more light. Frank knew he'd planted it in the wrong spot. He told me once he meant to move it in the autumn. Autumn came and went, and then another spring came, and there it was again. People keep telling me I outsmarted my daughter. I didn't. There was no trick. There was a public counter at the Land Registry office, a $9 fee, and an index that anyone could have searched on any Tuesday for 3 years. Any one of them. What my daughter had was a piece of paper she understood one way, and a mother she had stopped asking questions of. Those two things together will do what they did on a Tuesday morning in June more reliably than anything I could have planned. The only thing I'll tell you is this: find out what your own deed says while you still have the choosing of it. Walk into the Land Registry. Search your name. Read the granting clause. It costs less than lunch, and the document doesn't care who you are when you open it. That's my story. Drop a comment and hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.